A number of years ago, I had a public debate with a high school teacher who had his PhD on the question of whether evolution or God best explains morality. Of course, I argued that moral values exist and point towards God. Well, as soon as the debate was done, a local professor came up to me and he said, "How can you believe that God is on the side of morality when you look at the Bible and you especially look at slavery?" Interestingly enough, this professor said he was a former Christian. So I responded by saying, "This is a great question. In fact, since we're local, why don't we go out to a coffee shop and just talk about this together rather than me give you a quick response?" And we did. So we met up a few days later for probably an hour and a half. We sat down at this coffee shop and I basically said, "I'm happy to talk through the Bible and slavery. But first, can you tell me how within your atheist worldview you get objective morality and you get human dignity? If you can tell me that, then I'll address why the Bible deals with slavery." In the 90 minutes, we never got there. Now, my point was not to avoid the issue, but to challenge him and help him realize that if he's going to challenge the Bible as being immoral, he needs to first have a standard of right and wrong. And I don't see how you get this standard without there being a God. See, atheists can know right and wrong, as we saw in the last study, but they can't give us an account of objective moral values and duties. With that said, let's take a look at how we might address the challenge of slavery from looking at the scriptures. First, it's really important to see that Christians did not invent slavery. It's not the Judeo-Christian tradition that first decided to enslave people. In fact, you see slavery going back essentially to all the great nations throughout the history of the world. Ancient China, ancient India, throughout the Middle East, we see slavery as a universal institution. And as we'll unpack in a point coming up in a moment, what really is the Judeo-Christian tradition that first challenged the morality of slavery. Now, second, remember, God's chosen people were formerly slaves. The basic story of the Old Testament that is still important today to Christians and still central to Jews is the Exodus out of Egypt. Because God's chosen people for 430 years were slaves in Egypt. So if there's going to be any people group that understands the dignity of slaves, understands the plight of slaves, understands and would have compassion for people who are slaves, it'd be the Israelites, who have this as really their founding tradition and experience. Third, Israel was the first country that had laws that began to recognize the dignity of slaves. If you look at the Old Testament Mosaic Code and all the laws that are taught there, and you contrast it with other ancient moral codes, such as the Law of Hammurabi, what you see is a drastic difference when it comes to the dignity of slaves. The idea that a slave had dignity and value was a foreign idea first introduced in the biblical tradition. In fact, in most other traditions, slaves were basically property. You could injure a chair, you could injure your yard, you could injure a slave, you could injure an animal. But as we see in Exodus chapter 21, if a master injures a slave, that slave goes free. You see, the slave had dignity. What else you see in Exodus chapter 21 is that if an owner kills a slave, this owner would receive the death penalty. This is totally foreign to the other ancient codes of the time. You see, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, is the idea that slaves actually had equal value as slave owners. You also see, required by the Old Testament law, that a slave would get a day of rest for the Sabbath. Fourth, biblical slavery was different than the kind of slavery practiced in the West. You see, we use the same word, slavery, for the Old Testament slavery in the West, but they're not identical. In fact, there's some pretty significant differences. So, for example, Exodus 21:16 outlaws kidnapping people and forcing them into slavery, which was the basis of so much of the slave trade in the West. Exodus 21:16 says this: "Whoever steals a man and sells him, and anyone found in possession of him shall be put to death. Paul Copan gives an analogy that I think more accurately captures the idea of a slave in the Old Testament. He says it's kind of like a professional athlete who is sold to a team, so to speak, or the government's ownership of somebody who joins the military for a season. Not a perfect analogy, but certainly closer to capturing the idea of what it meant to be a slave, really a servant, in biblical times. But fifth, realize slavery is not God's ideal. God takes a broken, universal institution and begins to reform it for good. We actually see this in the New Testament. In Philemon 16 and 17, Paul said that Onesimus should be viewed, quote, no longer as a bondservant, but more than a bondservant, as a beloved brother, especially to me, but how much more to you, both in the flesh and in the Lord. So if you consider me your partner, receive him as you would receive me. Here's Paul, the great apostle, saying the slave is a brother. One of the reasons that the early church grew so much is that it included women, it included slaves, and says everybody is equal before the Lord. The abolitionist movements in both England and in the United States were led by Christians who took the scripture seriously, believed that all of us are created equal in the image of God. But you might be thinking, why didn't Jesus address slavery? Well, what I do find interesting is at his first public address in the synagogue, recorded in Luke 4:18, Jesus said, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim liberty to the captives and recovering of sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." How powerful that right at his opening speech, so to speak, in the synagogue, he talks about liberating people from oppression. So what do you do if you hear a new challenge like slavery and you don't initially know the answer? Well, first off, just take a deep breath. Maybe take 2 deep breaths. Second, realize that there is an answer. I've been doing this long enough to know that even when I hear new challenges, there is an answer if I'm willing to do my homework and look for it and find it and track it down. And also remember this lesson, how we saw at first slavery might seem like a real deep challenge in our minds of faith, but when we look in the context, we look in the scriptures, we find a reason why the scriptures allowed it for a season. Looking forward to see you in the next study.